Dear Colonel Larry Wilkerson, welcome back to Afghanistan.
Good to be with you.
Brilliant. I always look forward to the opportunity to speak with you here on this platform, but also I love to listen to your analysis wherever they may appear, because your analysis are so forthright, candid, and also comes with such experience throughout your career. And I was just thinking, actually, because we get to hear your assessment, your analysis on politics quite a bit. But we don't really get to hear about your exceptional career. And I thought maybe today we can touch upon that. And also we can see how that relates to, and it also shapes your opinion on the events of today. Um, because you've had a long and like a bright career. You've had many years working with Colin Powell in different capacities. I'd love to know more about that. But I think even from start, you graduated from the highest distinction from Naval War College. So would you mind telling us a little bit about the start of your career in the military?
Well, certainly. Let me see if I can make it as brief as possible.
Sure.
I, I started out leaving college right before my senior year um, to join the military because all my family had served. My wife's family had served, so I was watching people graduate from the Reserve Officer Training Program, second lieutenant commission, along with their baccalaureate. And one of my best friends graduated that way. He was a year ahead of me, and he was killed in Vietnam. So I felt like I wasn't doing my duty. So I left campus and joined the military. And I tried to get to Vietnam. I volunteered for Vietnam. I tried to get there.
Wow.
It took me 3 years because they kept saying, no, you need to stay here and train others. No, you need to stay here and educate others. So I
Really
finally
well. What was your rank at the time?
I was a second lieutenant when I enlisted man at first. I went up to sergeant specialist E5. And then I went to officer candidate school because they told me I could get to Vietnam a lot faster that way. And I was commissioned as second lieutenant. And then they made me a tactical officer, a trainer in the very battalion I'd been trained in myself. So I finally got frustrated and said to one of my bosses, a lieutenant colonel, I said, how do you get to Vietnam, sir? And he said, well, the fastest way is to go to flight school. I said, can I get on orders for flight school? He said, yes, you certainly can. So I went to helicopter training school, and that's how I got to Vietnam finally, almost 3 years after I volunteered.
Amazing. Whereabouts was that? So was that the start of the war, in middle, or kind of near the
No,
end?
it was because of that. I enlisted in '66, which was the middle of the war, a peak period for casualties and such. And I didn't get there until '69. So it was winding down to the point where I thought I would come back immediately. I served a year, came home, was an instructor pilot in the Army's helicopter school, and was looking for orders to go back to Vietnam, as was everyone else. And all of a sudden, I got orders to go to a very prestigious school and not to Vietnam. When I made inquiries, they said, no, we're sending you to school. You're not going back to Vietnam. So that got me out of the war zone, if you will, and started me on a schooling track that eventually led me to the Naval War College and learning about all the other services at Newport, Rhode Island.
How
Learning about all the other services and becoming far more cognizant of how policy and strategy were made. We studied everything from Thucydides and the ancient Greeks, the Romans, well, all the way up to World War II and such. And
How was your experience in Vietnam? Because it was a brutal war,
it was.
and people were deeply impacted by it.
As a low-ranking officer, especially as a platoon leader of a group of 10 helicopters that were, their mission was to do intelligence for a division-sized force operating in 3 Corps in southern Vietnam. And when I got there, they were taking casualties, and people were getting killed, and they weren't doing intelligence. So when I took over the platoon, I said, take your guns off, take your grenades out of your helicopters. You're going to be scouts like you're supposed to be. And they all hated me, because I took their their firepower away from them. I said, your job is to run if you start getting shot at, and live to report the intelligence. So they didn't dislike me for too long though, because we began to get praises from the division commander because we were actually doing our job. We were finding intelligence on the enemy and turning it over to the infantry.
How's the morale at the time? Like, did people think that something's being achieved, or was it a bit like, because near the end it became quite like a pointless exercise because the as I understand it, the areas that were being taken by U.S. Army quickly got taken back by the Vietnam forces and back and forth. So was there progress being made in your opinion at that time?
That was
Um,
when you look back on it after, when you're in it, your job is you and your men's survival. And it was all men then. That's all you think about is keeping your people alive. That was hard enough. But I did note that there were some idiosyncrasies, if you will, of that war that were just absolutely stupid to me. We would declare free fire zones, for example, and we'd shoot anything in that zone: tigers, elephants, water buffalo, or humans. And on several occasions, I watched some people shoot some people that probably didn't need to be shot. Little girls and little boys, in other words.
Wow. That
Now,
is a bit like what we see in the films, and it's not very wrong. Like, in your opinion, is there a movie that you think really, when you saw it, you thought this actually was a bit like, very
yeah,
much like what we
the
think?
movie Apocalypse Now shows very much about what it
I was
was
just
like.
thinking of that. Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
brilliant movie.
and it was much like later I would watch Iraq and Afghanistan turn into when the insurgency started in Iraq, and you had an ongoing insurgency in Afghanistan for 20 plus years. So it's a stupid place for militaries to try and operate, really. I mean that term right, stupid. It is unwise. It is stupid to be there.
And also, so kind of like from your experience in Vietnam, and you were there in Afghanistan and Iraq, did you foresee the resistance kind of um, evolving to the state that it was? Because for me, obviously, I'm not a military man or anything like that, but I was just thinking, Afghanistan, I thought the resistance would be very tough for the US to be, just because of the terrain, the mountainous terrain is easy for people to kind of hide. And but Iraq is quite a flat kind of a land, and I thought maybe it's not going to be a similar kind of situation. But in your opinion, even when it started, did you kind of foresee things going this way?
in both theaters, yes. In fact, my recommendation to Secretary of State Powell was get out of Afghanistan as fast as possible. Do what you need to do. Take care of what you can of Al Qaeda. We even messed that up because we took our eye off the ball, let bin Laden get away, and much of Al Qaeda get away too, and leave. Don't stay around. Leave. And put the message out to Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups like them. You come back and establish camps again, and we'll do it again. And we'll do it as many times as we have to, but we're not going to stay around in Afghanistan. That's nonsense. In Iraq,
How long were you?
it was just a stupid war.
How long
Um,
were you there in Afghanistan?
what?
Were you there in Afghanistan? How long were you posted there?
No, I was at the State Department at that time.
Okay,
I'd already joined Colin Powell
sure.
at that time. In
So
fact,
yeah,
I
so
joined him during the first Iraq War, which was a war that made sense because the United Nations gave us a mandate.
yeah,
That mandate was to kick Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait. We accomplished that and left. That was a
and it was a
smart.
quick war, no? Like it was like there seemed to be a clear objective, a- and it was achieved, and then the forces withdrew. It kind of, from that point of view, it made sense. But the second war just seemed to have
The
no kind of.
Second War was really stupid in a geostrategic sense, and Powell and I talked about this several times.
I'd
When
love to hear your
the
opinion
Shah
about.
fell
I'm
in
sorry.
Iran, there was no more policemen for the United States in the Persian Gulf. So what happened after the Shah fell and the Iraq-Iran war broke out was a rough balance of power was established between Tehran and Baghdad. that maintained some sort of equilibrium in the Gulf, and we didn't have to intervene. Well, our argument against the second Iraq war was this is not very smart because you're going to destroy the balance of power in the Gulf. Once you take out Saddam Hussein, Iran will be all powerful. There will be no balance of power. So you have two choices after that. You either abandon the Gulf and let Iran take it over, or you balance them yourself. And that's what we chose to do. And that's what we've been doing ever since, using Israel as our attack dog on occasion to help us. So the war in Gaza really is not about Israel so much as it is about the empire, the American empire. We're just using Israel to do what we won't do in the Persian Gulf. And it's so clear to a military professional, but it's not clear to the civilians, and the civilians propagandize it and make it look like as if AIPAC controls the United States. It does control the United States Congress, but that's not the reason we're doing what we're doing with Israel. We're doing it because if they weren't doing it, we believe we'd have to be doing it.
Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business, or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. I think you're absolutely right. I think the Gulf removal of Saddam Hussein was such a eventful kind of a decision because everything changed after that, and America, USA just seems to get deeper and deeper entrenched into the whole scenario with no way out. But before we get that, because I would love to know more about your opinion of the Gulf War, also about Colin Powell as a person, because you worked with him for a long time. But before we get to that, I'm sorry I distract you. So after the Vietnam War, from there, how did your career develop, and how did you get to the stage where you were working with Colin Powell?
Once I had finished my combat tour and started schooling, I rose rather rapidly in that schooling and wound up at the Naval War College, as I said, learning about strategy and policy. Well, once you graduate from that school, that attracts people to you. And so after I had gone back to be a professor there, indeed, and teach the courses myself, Colin Powell asked me to come to Washington and join him right out of the blue. Just right out of the blue, got a phone call one day from my admiral. He said, "Come down here. The National Security Advisor wants to speak to you." I said, "The National Security Advisor? Ronald Reagan's National Security Advisor?" He said, "Yeah, he's on the phone. He wants to talk to you."
You had never met him until that point?
What's that?
Had you never met him until that point?
No, never met him. In fact, I remember asking the admiral, "What kind of name is Colin? Isn't that something in the bottom of your stomach?" He said, "Well, it's in British, it would be Colin, but he calls himself Colin." And he told me a story about that later. But I joined him about 30 days later, and I stayed with him for about 16 years. And the principal reason he hired me initially was to write his speeches for him. And then we began to talk a lot together because speech writing with him was a real arduous task. I spent Saturdays and Sundays at his quarters because it was Saturday and Sunday when we wrote the big speeches. And he wrote most of his own speeches with you giving him input. So I got to know him really well, and he got to know me.
Did you find out later how he decided to choose you? What was it that attracted him to getting you on board?
What attracted him?
Mm-hmm.
3 things he told me. First of all, I wasn't ambitious. I told him I didn't want the job when he interviewed me. And he said, "Why?" I said, "I'm happy where I am teaching." He said, "That speaks well of you. You're happy where you are." Okay. And I thought, well, I just killed my chances. I won't get the job. Went back to Newport, and 30 days later, he called me. The second reason was he said, "You're not ambitious. You're not Cassius with a lean and hungry look. I probably can trust you." And the third reason he said was because I said I love soldiers, and he loved soldiers too. More
Yes,
so
I've heard
than
about that.
any general officer I ever met.
It's amazing you've had such an exceptional career and you are saying you were not ambitious.
Well, I wasn't. I was very happy where I was. And
It's
I
amazing.
had a good relationship with the Navy admiral, and he depended on me to develop the curriculum at the college because I was the only member of his staff at that time who had joint service. In other words, served with all the other services: Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. And so he depended on me to develop the curriculum, which was then mandated by Washington, by the Pentagon,
Wow.
called joint curriculum, because we were trying to force the services to operate better together. And so one of the reasons we started the joint curriculum was to educate officers in how to work with the other services.
I've heard you talk about the course that you were teaching and the environment, the way you taught. It just sounds so amazing. Because of your experience, you were able to create that kind of environment where you could put people in kind of scenarios, but that seemed very realistic, and you kind of put pressure on them to make decisions.
It was a
It sounds it's
terrific
amazing.
environment. When I taught at William and Mary and the George Washington University as a civilian for 16 years at William and Mary and 6 years at GWU, I took that philosophy into civilian education. My students, what are we going to do? We're going to have a war game? Yeah, we're going to have a war game. We're going to have a simulation. I'd use the civilian term. We're going to have a simulation. I would make them play the members of the National Security Council, for example, including the President of the United States. And I'd make them meet for 3 hours and wrestle with critical decisions. It's a good way to teach. It's a very good way to teach. And a lot of the people I taught at the Naval War College went on to be generals and admirals. So I felt like I was having a real impact on the future leadership of the American military. That's one reason why I was very satisfied where I was.
Wow. So when the first Gulf War did end, what was the thinking at the time about Saddam Hussein? Was America like kind of happy to have Saddam Hussein in place, and why was the decision made to go into Iraq again?
A second time?
Yeah.
You have to go into one of my seminars with my students and get them to list the reasons for you. There are at least 7 or 8 reasons we went to war, and none of them had anything to do with the published reasons. There was oil for Israel, for example, a real mandate to get oil for Israel, and we got oil for Israel. We got it out of Syria and Iraq, mostly out of the Kurds in the north, but Israel's economy took off after that because previously they had been getting oil from Glencore, Mark Rich's company, stealing it from Saddam Hussein under the UN Oil for Food program, breaking sanctions and taking the oil. That energized the economic sector in Israel. And once Mark Rich was arrested and put in jail for these dealings, they lost that. So we went to war in Iraq and turned it back on again, big time. Cheap too, discounted oil prices. So it was oil for Israel. There's a great book on that by Gary Vogler out right now. I got a copy of it here. It's called Israel and the Iraq War, a war for oil for Israel. And the second reason was Bush was angry at Saddam Hussein for trying to kill his father, supposedly.
That was true, was it?
Yeah.
That really did impact him.
And a third reason was just Israel, period, in terms of their most formidable enemy, they thought, in the region, other than Iran, was Iraq. And so they wanted Iraq taken down. So there you got 2 reasons that Israel wanted to go over. And that's the reason Donald Rumsfeld said the Mossad ran the Pentagon. And every time I would go over to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy's office, I would encounter more Mossad than I did Americans. And there's some truth to the fact that Israel was influencing that war big time. Another
Yes, I
reason,
was going to say so, because people talk about who controls who, like out of USA and Israel, who's actually running the shots. And unlike Professor Meshamer, you have said that, in your opinion, it's the USA that is in control, and USA uses Israel. But on that occasion, you agree that it was actually Israel that was using America to
well,
fulfill its own
it's
ambition.
symbiotic. It's a
Mm.
symbiotic relationship. There were Americans who were right there with them,
Yeah.
and there were Americans there all the time that Israel was doing something for the United States. And this glaring, apparent relationship didn't come out of the blue. It's been there for a long time. But after 9/11, the wrappers were taken off, the disguise was taken off. I mean, Lindsey Graham says on the floor of the United States Senate, if we were there doing it, we'd be getting people killed. We'd be getting our soldiers and our troops in general, we'd be getting them killed.
Mm.
Israel's getting its troops killed. Another time he said, if they weren't doing it, we'd have to be there doing it. Well, that's the truth. That's the way certain people in the empire believe. And so I'd say Mearsheimer's wrong, not from the point of the Congress. Yeah, AIPAC influences the Congress, no question about that. But in terms of what Israel ultimately does or doesn't do, it's usually at the United States' behest. Now, that doesn't mean Bibi Netanyahu knows he's a tool, but he is a tool. He's a tool just like other people in the world are.
Yeah.
Zelensky's a tool.
Yeah.
Zelensky is a U.S. tool to bleed Russia. Zelensky doesn't think that. He doesn't know that, but he is. And that's the way the empire operates.
It's true. So also, I think you're absolutely right. There were stated reasons why USA wanted to go to remove Saddam Hussein. None of them made sense. Like there was claims that he has links to terrorists, which actually wasn't proven. But the links then terrorists and Iraq got even stronger after the war. There was this talk about weapons of mass destruction, which became a big thing. And I'd like to get your opinion on that because Colin Powell was like at that point, I think Colin Powell was very important, his opinion, because he was respected throughout the world. And I think people were really let down by when he made that kind of statement on weapons of mass destruction. So what was your thoughts on that?
Yeah, he said it was the lowest point in his career, and he wished he hadn't done it. I said the same thing about my own participation in it. But I will say that it was very difficult for him to crawl out from under the responsibility to do it because George Tenet and his deputy, John McLaughlin, the two representing the entire U.S. intelligence community, and as a matter of fact, representing France, Germany, Japan, Israel, Australia, and
Yes.
others, all agreed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They all agreed. Now, later we would learn that George Tenet, the director of Central Intelligence for us, for the Empire, essentially strong armed most of the other countries' intelligence communities or cherry picked them. In other words, they had people in majority who disagreed with Tenet's position on WMD, but he found the people in the French intelligence community and the German intelligence community and so forth, the BMD, that would agree with him. And so he picked them to be the ones that came to the meetings. It was a very carefully orchestrated plot to make it look as if Saddam Hussein still had weapons of mass destruction. And then George Tenet went to Georgetown University afterwards. I'm watching it on CNN, called my boss in, Secretary of State, said, "You got to hear this. Listen to this man." And I hit the thing and replayed it. I never said, this is a direct quote, I never said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, unquote. He said that at Georgetown University right after the war, or right after the initial stages of the war. And Powell said, "I don't believe I heard that." I said, "You did, and I did too." How many times did he tell us that he was absolutely certain that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? And here he is after the war trying to excuse himself. So Powell was lied to. He was lied to by the vice president, and he was lied to by the director of Central Intelligence, and he was certainly lied to by his deputy, John McLaughlin, who was the real orchestrator of the intelligence. I call John Machiavelli plus. So, you say, well, he was a grown man, a mature man. He'd been in the bureaucracy for a long time. He should have known he was being lied to. Well, it's one thing to say you're being lied to by this or that entity within the complex, but when all 16 of them are standing up and telling you that that's what the picture is, it's pretty hard to defy them. And people who tell me had he left the administration at that point, resigned over the requirement to do that presentation, I look at him and I laugh. I said, are you kidding me? It would have lasted a week and Condi Rice would have been the Secretary of State within a week, confirmed by the Congress, and we'd have gone right on with the war. Don't you understand this administration? It's the worst bunch of guys and gals in post-World War II history. And Condi was no better. She was the whole 4 years. She was lusting to be Colin's replacement. She wanted that job so bad she could taste it. And so she knew, I can't possibly defy the president. Well, the National Security Advisor is supposed to defy the president if she or he thinks they're wrong. But she never would. She'd join Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and gang up on Powell. So it was an administration he should have left. Yeah, he should have left maybe after about 2 years. Probably should have left after George W. Bush told Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister of Israel, over to you, Mr. Prime Minister. What? Sharon said. Over to you. Everything's failed. All the peace process, all this stuff has failed. Powell was there when he was saying this. Powell had just met with Arafat in the region. and Powell's looking like a deer caught in the headlight, too. But that's what the president told him. And from that moment on, Israeli prime ministers have had their head. They can do whatever they want to. But that was the direction of the empire. That wasn't their predilection. It was the direction of the empire.
Wasn't there an understanding from even advice from regional governments not to remove Saddam Hussein because of the vacuum that's going to get created? And ultimately, obviously, as we know, Iran benefited from that, if anything. So did they kind of just not listen to anyone and just push on, or was bad advice coming from?
You're right. Their plan, which I uncovered, Wes Clark, I think, General Wes Clark, who's talked about this a lot, was a little bit off. Well, he discovered something that I didn't discover. I discovered something else, but it was similar. Their plan was to go right on to Syria and push Assad out of office. They thought that Saddam Hussein would fall within 30 days, and they were close to being right. They just didn't guess on the insurgency starting so quickly, and they thought they'd just keep on going right into Syria and topple Assad. From that position, having conquered Iraq and Syria, they would then take on Iran. That was.
I remember there was talks even then about taking on. There was some statement about how boys go to Iraq and men go to Iran or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was.
Yeah.
But there was talks about moving straight into Iran. So, yeah.
The insurgency really hampered them. And Rumsfeld had purposefully kept the troops in Iraq well below what, for example, Powell had told him he needed. And when Powell talked to Tommy Franks, the general in charge of the invasion, so to speak, Tommy Franks said, well, I can't do anything about it. He wanted me to do it with 55,000. I'm lucky to have 164,000, which was the final count. And Powell said, well, in the first war, when we just kicked him out of Kuwait, we had 625,000 troops. Yeah, well,
wow.
Rumsfeld was very anxious to prove Powell wrong. Very anxious. He wanted it to be very small. He wanted it to be shock and awe. He wanted to turn to Colin and say, took you 600,000 troops to do it. I did it with 50,000.
Did they underestimate the removal of Saddam Hussein because of the success of the first Gulf War?
To a certain extent, yes, because they thought they had the same pushover even if they lingered in the country. Yeah. Well, that's one reason the first President Bush didn't linger, because he knew he'd get caught up in an insurgency, and he didn't want that.
What's your opinion of the experience and the way of working of the first Bush and the second Bush, the father and the son?
Light years different. light years different. The father was the most experienced president since Dwight Eisenhower. He'd been ambassador to China. He'd been head of the RNC. He'd been, most importantly of all, really, he'd been director of the CIA, the only one so beloved of them that they named the buildings after him. It's now the Bush Center. And
Wow.
most incredibly, he had been the real power behind Ronald Reagan for 8 years. Bush was in on everything.
Wow.
So he had effectively been right next to the president in a very meaningful way for 8 years. So when he came in on his own to be president, he was very experienced and very schooled. And Powell said most of the time he had never met a man who understood his advice better than Bush. Powell didn't have to be that. But take the Los Angeles riots, for example, the Watt riots. Bush was getting ready through Cheney and others to crack down majorly on the blacks in Los Angeles. I mean, we were going to have blood in the street, major blood in the streets. Powell found out about it, rushed over to the White House, sat down with the president for about an hour and explained to him race relations in the United States and what it meant for Rodney King to be killed, or not killed, but treated the way he was treated in Los Angeles. Bush changed everything. He listened to Powell. He changed the orders that went out. He told the general in charge, don't be using any live ammunition. Don't be shooting anybody if you can possibly help it. Only shoot if you're in danger yourself. And it turned out halfway decent. We didn't kill a whole bunch of people. That was Powell. And that was Bush listening to the voice of experience. That was George H.W. Bush.
What about your experience of what was the relationship like between the UK and USA? Because we had Tony Blair in the UK. Was the UK being kind of dragged along in the whole Gulf War situation, or was the UK there edging USA on, thinking because Tony Blair was criticized hugely because of the resistance there was for the Second Gulf War, and he still went on. There was some huge mass demonstrations here.
I was in London in the middle of those. I've never seen such incredible demonstrations.
Yeah.
Bobbies on their horses couldn't even move.
People have not forgotten and not forgiven him for that, although he keeps insisting.
Well,
he keeps trying to justify.
What I saw was a prime minister who initially was offering some opposition. But then he realized quickly, and most dramatically after the visit to the ranch out at the Texas ranch of Bush's, he realized it wasn't going to make any difference what he said. So he decided, I need the special relationship more than I need anything else to keep England afloat. Therefore, I am going to go be a cheerleader. And after that, he turned into a cheerleader for the war. We got the most absurd propaganda at the State Department that he put together. He told his people, put all these things together that are unclassified and send them to America so they can use them for, convincing the American people that this law. We'd look at that stuff and a college freshman could have done a better job. It was horrible stuff. But he was so anxious to help us that he bent over backwards to do it.
Also, do you
remember his statement in London when he said that Saddam Hussein could hit the city in 45 minutes with?
Yes, I remember that.
Even we went, what? Where did that come from?
Yes, ridiculous and shameful. Colin Powell had such a good reputation until that kind of weapons of mass destruction speech. There was talks of him becoming the first black president in America. Did you ever have that conversation with him? What was his opinion?
Yes, I think we started the conversation in 1993 and 94, just in terms of he was getting ready to retire from the chairmanship in October 1993. And I said, what's in the future for you? And that sort of started the conversation that kept on going for a while through 94 and then up to 95 when he had a committee in every state of the union. He had committees set up to get him elected.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the odd thing was, it was like Eisenhower. You remember when Eisenhower was running, Truman actually called Eisenhower and told him he'd step down and you know, let him have it. And Eisenhower said, "Nice of you, but I think I'll run."
Mm.
But that's what was happening. Both Republicans and Democrats wanted Powell to be their standard bearer, and this was very embarrassing to Bill Clinton. Very embarrassing. Um, so Powell considered it right up to November the 8th, as I recall. I might be wrong on the specific date, but it was November. And we had a meeting of the principal advisors, political and otherwise, to him. And he shocked almost all of us and said, "I'm going to the Ramada Inn. I'm going to have in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm going to have a press conference, and I'm going to announce that I'm not going to run."
Wow.
And he did. And they put out the reasons were his wife, Alma. That was some of it.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
Yeah, she was having just normal problems with depression that some people have, and she was on medications. But he was worried that the intrusions that are necessary for being the first lady would deepen that and make it worse. But he told me in a private moment what the real reason was. And I think he
Mhm.
was telling me the truth. He looked me square in the eye and he said, "Larry, are you happy or disappointed or whatever?" And I said, "Well, I'm disappointed, but only from the perspective that I think he would have made a very good president."
Mm.
He said, "I don't have the fire in my belly." I said, "I can understand that." I knew how he detested politicians, really. Yeah.
Mm.
Worked with them all the time and was a good one himself, but he
Yeah.
just didn't like politics. It was too dirty. It was so much different from being a military officer. Um, and
I
he
think he
just
would have made
just
a good
said that. I
president.
knew right there. I knew right there at that moment that I understood he didn't want the job. But
Mm.
then all through my academic career afterwards on civilian campuses, I would have seminars where I would ask my students, "What do you think would have been the difference?" And they would say, "Oh, it would have been very different."
Mm.
I got to think, right, we would not have the world we have today with respect to the American empire if Powell had been president instead of William Jefferson Clinton. Powell would have never expanded NATO. Powell was after, as was a number of people around him, including H.W. Bush, a relationship with Russia that brought them into Europe, significantly into Europe, not just on the map, and eventually made them either an observer or a full member of the political alliance and then the military alliance, or stood the alliance down as no longer necessary.
Mm.
That was Powell's whole purpose in '93 and '94. Bill Perry came along and was Bill Clinton's second Secretary of Defense and felt the same way. And Bill Perry resigned because his president didn't feel that way. One of the reasons Clinton didn't feel that way is he wanted some national security bona fides because he thought Colin Powell was going to beat him in '95. So he felt he had to get some bona fides in the security world because he was a draft dodger in the security world and not very respected within the military. So he had to go find a war somewhere to get into, and he had to put on some boots and trudge around in the Balkans. And that's what he did. Bombed the hell out of them for 78 straight days, this warrior. And expanded NATO to the point where now it's fait accompli, and we have made Russia very angry.
It's amazing. Given Colin Powell's views, as you've expressed, and given that both Republican Party and the Democrats were kind of competing to get him on board, you'd think that with the man with those kind of views, the deep state would kind of try to isolate him rather than allow that kind of a situation where he could become the president.
Well,
I think he would have been an awesome president, but is that the strength of his personality? How did that kind of...
you don't understand the deep state. The deep state wants someone who can get elected. And at that particular point in time, they didn't think Clinton could get reelected, but they knew Powell could get elected.
Right.
The debate was over which party they should put on his hat. Should he be an elephant or should he be a donkey? That was the real debate. But you're right. They thought they could control him. They thought they could use him. And I think they were wrong, essentially. And I think we'd have a different country right now had he
I
started.
think so.
Yeah.
I think especially after that mistake he made with weapons of mass destruction, I don't think he would have allowed a similar kind of a mistake to be made again in his career.
I'm pretty sure he wouldn't. He wouldn't have made, he was against the war, as was I, and we were both against it for good geostrategic reasons. You're going to destroy the balance of power in the Gulf, and we will have to become the other fulcrum of that balance. You are going to have to put major forces on the ground in the region, or you're going to have to energize Israel to do it for you, or you're going to have to do both. And what we've done is both. Americans do not know that we have more troops in the Levant than we have in Europe, Korea, Japan, or any other place other than continental United States. They're in the Middle East. We have the largest naval fleet in the Middle East. We have the largest air bases in the Middle East. We have more fighter jets at LUD than we do anywhere in the United States in a single location. We're there. We're there for better or worse. And it's usually worse.
Yeah. If Colin Powell did run for elections for president, ultimately, which side do you think he would have gone to, the Democrats or Republicans?
That was a big debate there, that period I was telling you about, right before he made his final announcement. And though he had people on both sides who were courting him and trying to get him to declare for them, his inclination was towards the party he had come from. And it was principally because of Ronald Reagan. Serving Ronald Reagan convinced him, I think, that the Republicans had a better handle on the empire's needs than the Democrats did.
I think it would have been great.
He used to say this. He used to say to me repeatedly, he would say, I'm a Republican for national security. I'm a Democrat for domestic policy.
Yeah. Because he ended up supporting Obama at the end, didn't he?
Very much so. And he was euphoric, cried crocodile tears when Obama was elected. It meant getting rid of George W. Bush and everything he stood for, he thought. And it meant a black man had been elected president of the United States. And that was enough to bring tears to his eyes. I think later he closed up pretty much, wouldn't talk to me very much. But later he realized the deep state had got Barack Obama too.
Yeah. I think it would have been great if he did stand and if he beat Clinton. I think it would have been amazing.
It'd been a different world, I think. Really, it would have. Barack Obama told me to my face, with John Kerry, his Secretary of State at the time, sitting beside him in the Roosevelt room in the White House. I almost fell off my chair. He looked at me and General Paul Eaton, who was there with me, and he said, there's a bias in this town toward war. Those are his exact words. And then he went on for about 30 minutes describing how he didn't know what to do about that bias.
Harry, also, given this and given what you just talked about, how such a heavy presence there is of USA in the Levant, why is that? And why? Because I was just looking at like all the deaths that have happened in the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. Why are Arab lives so cheap? Is that a problem with the Arabs? Is it a problem with the USA racism against the Arabs? Is it a problem with the oil being present in the Arab countries? Is it Israel? Why are Arab lives so cheap? Because that kind of thing doesn't happen anywhere else.
Lift your comment up a little bit to a different plane and say, why is non-white life so cheap? Because that's what you're really asking. The Arabs just happen to be classified by whites in this country as non-white. So you're looking at it's coming out right now. You should see the things that have come out in executive orders here. Take the ones that were just passed at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. They just knocked down all their clubs, for example, for their undergraduates that have anything to do with versatility, with diversity, with what was the one? There was a Black History Club. They took everything down. The only thing they left was the German language club and the French language club. They took about
Wow.
16 clubs down for the cadets at West Point. That's just the tip of the iceberg. They're going through the federal bureaucracy and eliminating anything that doesn't focus on white people. Peter Thiel right now, a huge donor, and a big backer of J.D. Vance. Peter Thiel is trying to get white people back in charge in South Africa and a plan for working on that. We love white people. We don't like anybody else.
Wow, that is amazing. And I think you're right, actually. It kind of makes sense if we put that analysis into the context of history. I think it makes sense. Also, I haven't actually talked to anyone about this before because I didn't think it was serious, but it just doesn't go away from the news at the moment. What do you think about proposal to evacuate Gaza and rebuild there and to kind of migrate the population somewhere else, evaporate it?
As I understand it, last night he's already walked it back pretty significantly. I think that's a trait of Donald Trump. He puts these things out there for shock, and then he walks them back, like the tariffs against Canada and Mexico. There's been no real concessions by Canada or Mexico, but he said there were, and took the tariffs off. He left the tariffs on China, of course, which remains to be seen what will happen. I know this. I know most of our coal goes to China. A great preponderance of our coal goes to China, and we still mine a lot of coal. So it's going to be interesting to see what the tariffs on coal do. He'll probably back off of that eventually too, or he'll double down and make it even worse with China, because I don't think he gives a damn about China. He does give a damn about Canada and Mexico. He wants them. So this is a strange man, and look for more strange things like this to come out. I mean, Jared Kushner wants to build hotels on the Mediterranean, and Trump says to Jared, "Oh, that's a great idea. I think I'll do that." You know, look at Bibi's face during that interview. I mean, you know, besides looking like a pig and so content he could hardly stand it, he's kind of wondering, it looks like, what's he talking about? But he's got to go along with it. And what he's looking for, of course, is a clear shot at not going any further in the ceasefire and resuming the war. That's what he's looking at.
Yeah.
And the videos that came back from the Palestinians pouring through the crossing, going back into North Gaza, the Nazarene corridor, pouring through there and going back, the videos were just astounding. They were euphoric. They were walking through their homes utterly destroyed, their hospitals, their schools, their mosques utterly destroyed. And yet they were euphoric because, as one woman said to the camera in English, we're going home. We're going home. You know, you're going to take those people and send them somewhere else. You got another thing coming, Mr. President.
Yeah.
They'll fight you tooth and nail to the last beating heart.
You're so right. And that's why I've never really taken this seriously. I've never really talked to anyone about this, any guests, because firstly, I think is if we start taking every statement that Trump makes seriously and start kind of analyzing it, we're just going to be going round in circles.
Yeah.
Secondly, actually, this whole thing lasted longer than I thought it was going to last. I thought it's just going to be one statement and then we'll be over with. But when it did last a bit longer, I was then started to think, is this, first of all, an attempt to kind of appease Bibi and continue the ceasefire, as you say, but also then to bring Saudi Arabia on board back to the Abraham Accord. And at that point, they can kind of take the statement back, which would then give Saudi Arabia the kind of a bone that they can throw that way to say that, okay, this is what we got out of Trump. We got him to back off from this plan. I started thinking maybe it's something to do with that.
Now, with regard to Mohammed bin Salman and his plans, yes, that's a distinct possibility. I don't think it's going to work because I think he's smarter than that. And he'll smell a rat there. But it is consequential, I think, to the Palestinian fate that the other Arabs will back off of them in a heartbeat. if they're presented with a deal. I don't think they'll back off of them to the extent that we can ship them to Indonesia or ship them to Egypt and Jordan, but they will back off. They will back off and accommodate whatever the U.S. wants to do if it's not too in your face. I got another interview here in about 5 minutes, so
okay, cool. Last question. What do you think? Is there going to be? Do you think there's going to be tariffs coming up for Europe?
I think huge changes are coming. They're getting ready. Apparently, my conversation with several really smart Germans in Berlin and in Munich over the last week is that probably what's going to happen on 23 February is we're going to have a slight majority for the Christian Democrats, and they're going to create a coalition that is going to push up to their chancellorship a former CEO of BlackRock. Yes. The Germans are going to put a former CEO of BlackRock in charge of their country with the economy and the problems it's in right now. That's just going to create more billionaires. That's just going to concentrate more wealth in the hands of the fewer people in Germany. This is a tragedy developing right now, but they can't break out of this multiple party system they've got and how it works into a coalition. They're probably going to get this guy Merz as their new chancellor.
Because I thought it's hilarious how the Europeans, especially the Germans, allowed Biden to hollow out the economy of Germany and Europe.
Their pipeline. I'm no doubt in my mind we did it.
Larry, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you. Let's do this again soon.
Thank you for the chance.